North of Rugby, West Coast Main Line. 2. 17 inches the morning, January 1953. Thomas Whitfield, 47. 12 years sorting for the Down Special TPO, was standing at frame 4 in the third sorting van when the train took the curve before Tamworth. The carriage swayed. Whitfield did not move to correct for it. After 12 years on this run, the sway through Tamworth had become part of his body's working knowledge, absorbed, unprocessed. Present the same way, the sequence of his 48 pigeonholes was present, not consciously known, but there, in the hands. He had the letter for Edinburgh in his right hand. He was already reading the next. Outside the sorting van, Britain was dark. The furnace glow of the Midlands had been behind them for half an hour. Ahead, the long run north through Preston, Carlisle, the border, Whitfield did not see any of it. He had 12 years of the same journey, the same darkness, the same sequence of frames and sub-bags growing heavy as the train moved north. He had sorted letters for Edinburgh, for Glasgow, for Aberdeen, for towns in the central lowlands and the highlands beyond, for 12 years in this same carriage. He had never been to any of them. He had never met a single person whose letter had gone through his hands. That distinction between knowing the system and knowing the person was the whole of it. Fred Holroyd, on the Brighouse round, had the Marsden envelope in his right hand before the gate, because 14 years of Thornton Street had told him what to expect. Thomas Whitfield had the Edinburgh letter in his right hand before the pigeonhole, because 12 years of the Down Special had put Edinburgh on the third rack, second column, upper row, and his hands knew the position before his eyes confirmed the address. Both men knew their letter. Neither man knew it the same way. Whitfield's knowledge was the knowledge of the system. Holroyd's knowledge was the knowledge of the door. What did 12 years of sorting the Down Special give a man that the chalk labels on his pigeonholes could not give him? And what did those chalk labels tell us about what the train was doing not for the post office, which measured it in bags and miles, but for the people who had posted before the evening collection and gone to bed, trusting that what they had written was already moving north? Before you can understand what Thomas Whitfield was doing in sorting van 3 of the Down Special in January 1953, you need to understand what the train was. The Down Special TPO, formerly the Northwestern TPO, Night Down until 1923, then renamed as the Down Special, was the flagship service of the British Travelling Post Office network on the West Coast Main Line. It ran every night from London Euston to Aberdeen, with its sister train, the Up Special, running the reverse journey simultaneously. Together, they formed the spinal column of British mail movement. Everything that Britain had written that day and posted before the evening collection was sorted somewhere in this system before morning. The train itself was a sorting office on wheels. In 1936, the GPO Film Unit documented the Down Special in a 24-minute film with words by W.H. Auden and music by Benjamin Britten. Produced for a budget of £2,000, funded by the General Post Office to show the country what was happening while it slept. The film showed 7 sorting vans and 40 postal workers, 6 sorters to each van, working 48 pigeonhole positions apiece, labelled in chalk with the name of a town or district. The chalk mattered. As the train moved north and districts were served and left behind, a sorter rubbed out the label on a finished position and chalked up the next. The pigeonholes were not fixed. The knowledge was. The train did not stop to sort. It sorted while it moved. Mailbags were loaded at Euston at the start of the journey and at major stations: Rugby, Tamworth, Crewe, Preston, Carlisle. Hundreds of bags were unloaded and fresh ones taken on. At Crewe, documented records confirm 500 bags came off and 1,000 went on. The entire exchange took 13 minutes. Then, the train continued north. At exchange points between stations, the train did not stop at all. A mechanical arm, the traductor, swung out from the side of the carriage, and leather pouches of mail were caught from trackside apparatus at up to 60 miles an hour. At the same moment, outgoing bags were released into ground nets. The exchange apparatus, a design by Inspector John Dicker that remained in use from 1852 until the final Lineside exchange, was made at Penrith, Cumberland, On 4 October 1971 required the sorter, operating it to work by trained instinct in the dark. A bell signaled the approach of an exchange point. The door rolled back. The man worked by what 12 years had taught his hands. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red vans. The documented operational reality of a postal system, and the specific human meaning of what it delivered, before the telephone changed what it meant to wait for news. What the night mail gave everyone who posted a letter before the evening collection was this: the certainty, while they slept, that what they had written was already moving north through the dark. And if you remember these letters, or wrote them, or waited for them, put it in the comments. Did you write or receive letters that travelled on the night mail? A letter posted in London before the evening collection that arrived in Edinburgh or Glasgow the following morning. We want to hear what the Down Special carried for your family. Next time on this channel, the rural postman and the 37 farmhouses. What an 11-year Devon round looked like, when the only daily contact between scattered communities and the outside world came up the lane on a bicycle. Back on the round. What was it that made the Down Special's exchange apparatus work at speed in the dark? And what did the 245 exchange points that dotted the network at its 1913 peak tell us about what Britain's postal system was built to do, that no road vehicle could yet do as reliably or as fast? Thomas Whitfield had memorized every postal district in Britain that the Down Special served. This was not a figure of speech. It was a vocational requirement. Post office staff instructions for TPO sorters required trained workers to carry in their heads the districts corresponding to each of their 48 pigeonhole positions, and to carry the sub-positions that applied at each stage of the journey. As the train moved north, the routing requirements changed. A sorter working London letters at the start of the journey was working Edinburgh and Glasgow letters 2 hours later, and Perth and Aberdeen letters an hour after that. The chalk labels on the pigeonholes were the visible record of where the train was in the night. The man behind them was the invisible record of where everything went. The training took time. Post office accounts from the period describe sorter training as involving intensive examination in postal geography, the districts, the towns, the sub-offices, the routing hierarchies for different categories of mail. A trained sorter on the Down Special could, at speed, in a moving carriage, in lamplight, sort accurately to hundreds of destinations across the British Isles. The ones who could not do this at speed were not on the Down Special. This was a coveted route, and turnover was low. Workers who joined the Down Special stayed. Accounts from the final years of the TPO operation describe sorters who had been on the same route for 20, 25, 30 years. The newest member of one documented crew had been on the job 11 years. What did that inhabitation look like? At 2 in the morning, north of Rugby, when a letter arrived at frame 4, addressed to a street in Dundee, and Whitfield's hand was already moving before his eyes had finished reading the postcode. It looked like this: the difference between a man who had learned a skill and a man who had become it. 12 years of sorting the same route, at the same time, in the same carriage, had given Thomas Whitfield something the post office's training manuals could describe, but not produce. They could specify the pigeonhole. They could not specify what happened to a man who had worked it for 12 years. What had 12 years of moving through the same darkness at speed done to his knowledge of Britain? And what did that knowledge feel like from the inside, when a letter from Korea passed through his hands on its way to Edinburgh, and he had no way of knowing whether anyone in Edinburgh had been going to the window every time they heard footsteps on the path. The Lineside exchange apparatus was the most technically extraordinary element of the travelling post office system, and the one that most clearly illustrated what the Down Special was built to do: move without pausing. The design was simple in principle. A mail pouch was hung from a standard, a metal post fixed to the ground beside the track. As the train passed, a net extended from the side of the sorting carriage caught the pouch at speed. Simultaneously, the traductor, a mechanical arm, swung out from the carriage and released an outgoing bag into a ground net. The exchange took seconds. The train never stopped. The pouches weighed between 20 and 50 pounds. The exchange occurred at speeds up to 60, sometimes 80, miles an hour. The sorter responsible for the apparatus operated it in a combination of sight, sound, and the interior knowledge that years of the same route had built in his hands. Post office accounts describe the exchange as requiring complete concentration. A bell rang to signal the approaching exchange point. The door rolled back, the net extended, and the man worked by what he knew. A mistake a net extended too early or too late meant a bag missed. Letters flung into a field in the dark, never recovered. Post office records document occasional misses. They were not common. For a trained sorter on the Down Special, who had worked the same exchange points for a decade, the timing was as exact as the chalk on the pigeonholes. At its peak in 1913, the exchange network extended to 245 points along Britain's main lines. It covered places the train could not pause for rural halts, minor junctions. The long stretches between stations where the track passed within reach of a village that needed its letters, but could not warrant a scheduled stop. The apparatus handled all of them, the heavy bag from the north at 60 miles an hour, caught by a man who knew the sound of the approach. The final Lineside exchange was made on 4 October 1971, north of Penrith in Cumberland. As the Northwestern Nightdown TPO neared the end of its overnight run, the exchange points had been declining for decades as road transport took over short-haul connections. The last exchange was not marked ceremonially. The net caught the final pouch from the final standard. The arm retracted, and the apparatus that had operated on British railways for 119 years was done. What had the country looked like in the years when all 245 of those exchange points were in motion? When the darkness along every major line in Britain contained a train full of men sorting other people's lives at speed, and the night landscape of the nation was threaded through with moving light and mechanical arms catching leather pouches. Out of the dark, the Down Special did not discriminate. This was the point of it. A letter posted in London before the 6 o'clock evening collection did not need to be important to be on the train. It did not need to be from a particular kind of person or addressed to a particular kind of household. It needed to reach the Euston sorting office before loading, and it needed a correct address. Beyond that, the system applied equally to everything: the court summons and the birthday card, the business letter from a Manchester firm, and the 2-page letter from a son in Korea, the cheque and the postal order, the postcard sent from Blackpool the previous afternoon. W. H. Auden's poem for the 1936 GPO documentary enumerated this: without hierarchy, letters for the rich, letters for the poor, the shop at the corner, the girl next door, letters of thanks, letters from banks, the typed and the printed, and the spelt all wrong. The poem was not romanticizing the letter, it was documenting the non-discrimination of the system. The Down Special carried not important mail, it carried all the mail. Thomas Whitfield's 48 pigeonholes received everything indiscriminately. A letter from a solicitor in Edinburgh went into the same rack position as a letter from a daughter to her mother in Morningside. A government circular sat beside a Christmas card. The sorter's job was not to evaluate what he was sorting, it was to sort it correctly and move on to the next. This was the limit of the TPO sorter's knowledge, and the point where it differed from the round postman's knowledge entirely. Fred Holroyd on the Brighouse round knew that the Marsden envelope was from Korea before he reached the gate. He knew from the handwriting, from the weight. From 14 years of Thornton Street. Thomas Whitfield knew which rack the Edinburgh letter went into. He did not know there was a family in Edinburgh who had been going to the window every time they heard footsteps on the path. Both kinds of knowledge were real. They were not the same knowledge. And what happened when the Edinburgh letter left Whitfield's hands and arrived at the local sorting office in the small hours of the morning was the moment the two kinds of knowledge joined, the system's knowledge, handing the letter to a postman who had the street's knowledge, and the letter completing its journey through human hands that knew entirely different things about where it was going. What happened in Edinburgh at 8 in the morning when the letters sorted through the night on the Down Special arrived at the local office? And a postman who had walked the same street for 12 years picked up what Thomas Whitfield had sorted north in the dark and walked up the path with it toward the door where someone had been waiting since the previous evening. The TPO sorter was the invisible stage of the postal system. Most people who received a letter in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, in Aberdeen, had no idea it had been sorted by hand on a moving train in darkness. At 2 in the morning, somewhere north of Crewe, the man who delivered the letter was visible. The sorting van was not. This invisibility was not an accident of the system's design. It was the system's purpose. The Down Special was not meant to be seen. It was meant to arrive, in the sense that what it contained was meant to arrive at doorsteps across Scotland and northern England, in time for the morning delivery. The people who received letters in Edinburgh at 8:30 on a January morning were receiving the product of two distinct kinds of human knowledge. The sorter's knowledge of postal geography, applied in darkness at speed, and the postman's knowledge of the street, applied in daylight at walking pace. Neither was sufficient without the other. What the TPO sorter knew precisely, and with no personal information behind it, was where everything went. What the round postman knew imprecisely, personally, accumulated over years, was what it mean when it arrived. The chain between them was the entire postal system. Neither man knew both things. Together, they covered the whole distance. Post office staff records from the operational period describe TPO sorters as among the most highly trained of postal workers required to pass examinations in postal geography, required to demonstrate sorting speed and accuracy before assignment to a fast night route, required to maintain performance under periodic inspection. The Nightmail film documented this without sentiment. 6 men to a van, 48 pigeonholes each, working at speed while the carriage swayed. The physical reality of the job, standing, sorting, swaying, in lamplight, through the night. Every night was not what the poem remembered. The poem remembered the train moving through sleeping towns, and the letters inside it. The men, sorting them, moved with the train, and did not sleep. Thomas Whitfield had been on the Down Special for 12 years. He had sorted through the final years of the Second World War, and through the years of post-war recovery. He had sorted through the peak years of personal letter writing in Britain, the late 1940s and 1950s, before the telephone reached most households, when the pigeonholes filled fastest and the sub-bags grew heaviest. And the overnight run carried more of what Britain had written that day than at any other point in the system's history. What did the post office's training examinations in postal geography produce in a man who had passed them and then worked the same route for 12 years, that a man who had passed them 6 months ago did not yet have? And what would be lost from the chain between the sorting frame and the morning delivery when the chalk labels on the pigeonholes were replaced, eventually, by barcodes that no human hand needed to read? The Down Special ran through both world wars. with modifications. During the Second World War, the TPO network operated under blackout conditions, no external lights on the carriages, sorting in reduced interior lighting. The exchange apparatus operating in complete darkness. A bell and trained instinct, the only guides to a moving exchange point in the dark. The postal system during wartime was one of the few operations the state treated as essential to civilian morale, a recognition that what the system carried during years of absence and anxiety was not a service, but a need. Post office records from the period document the increased volume of forces mail passing through the TPO network, letters from servicemen on active service, letters from families to sons in North Africa and Italy, and later in Korea. Letters marked on active service that had been read by a military censor before they were sealed and dispatched. Thomas Whitfield would have sorted those letters. He would have held them the same way he held all the others. Address read. District identified. Pigeonhole found. Next letter. He would not have known from the outside of the envelope that the contents had been read by a censor, or that it had been carried by a field post office courier across the Italian front before reaching the civilian system, or that the family to whom it was addressed had been waiting for it. For 6 weeks, the TPO sorter's knowledge stopped at the envelope. What the train carried in wartime was, in emotional weight, different from what it carried in peacetime. The sorting was the same. The pigeonholes were the same. The route was the same. But what was inside the envelopes had changed, or rather, what was inside the envelopes meant something different at the doorstep where it arrived. The system applied equally to all of it. The down special did not move more carefully for the letters that carried the most weight. It moved at 60 miles an hour, regardless. That was the only promise the system could make, and it was the right promise to make. Not that it would handle what it carried with extraordinary care, but that it would handle it at all, every night, without stopping, in the blackout, through the bombed cities of the Midlands, north to Scotland, and the families along the route who heard the sound of the train at night and knew or hoped that what they were waiting for was somewhere inside it, moving toward them in the dark. What did the families along the West Coast main line know when they heard the down special in the night during the war years about what was coming toward them through the dark? And what did it mean in 1940 and 1941 when the train arrived and the morning post came up the path and there was nothing from North Africa or Italy, and there was nothing again? The following morning, the TPO network began to contract in the 1980s. The reasons were operational and financial. Road transport had become flexible enough to cover most of the short-haul connections the network had been built to serve. And mechanized sorting, developing since the late 1950s, had become efficient enough that the economics of a moving sorting office no longer justified its complexity. Automated letter sorting machines, operating on barcodes and optical character recognition, could process mail faster than any team of trained sorters at standing frames. They could do it without swaying on the track. They did not need chalk. Rail express systems, formed in the 1980s to manage what remained of the network, introduced a hub-and-spoke restructuring in the 1990s that consolidated rail mail into a purpose-built London depot. Under the new system, many locations lost their direct TPO connections. By 2003, Royal Mail had decided it was no longer economical to transport mail by rail at all. The contract with the freight operator was suspended. The last TPO services ran on the night of 9 January 2004. The final load of mail aboard a travelling post office was put on at Yatton Station in Somerset in the early hours of 10 January 2004. The train moved west. By the time it reached Penzance, the sorters, those who remained, working in a system that had been contracting for 2 decades, were sorting mail down to individual delivery rounds. Then they stopped. Then the train stopped. And the 166-year-old practice of sorting Britain's mail by hand on moving trains, which had begun on the Grand Junction Railway in 1838 with a converted horsebox, was over. By then, email had already changed what the word letter meant. Personal correspondence had moved to the telephone in the 1960s and to the screen in the 1990s. What remained on the trains in the final years was business mail and direct advertising and parcels. The letters that had given the system its human weight were already somewhere else. Thomas Whitfield had retired from the Down Special in 1965. He had been on the route for 24 years. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There are more rounds, more sorting offices, more letters from active service, more emigrant envelopes that arrived at a door where someone had been going to the window every time a red van turned into the street. What the night mail gave everyone who posted a letter before the evening collection was this: the certainty, while they slept, that what they had written was already moving north through the dark. When that certainty ended not suddenly, but gradually, as the route contracted and the night trains grew fewer, what changed was not just a postal system. What changed was the specific form of trust that a night train had made possible. And if you have a letter kept in a drawer, or a shoebox from a father in the war, or a son in Australia, put it in the comments. Did you write or receive letters that travelled on the night mail, a letter posted in London before the evening collection that arrived in Edinburgh or Glasgow the following morning? We want to hear what the Down Special carried for your family. Next time on this channel, the rural postman and the 37 farmhouses, what an 11-year Devon round looked like. When the only daily contact between scattered communities and the outside world came up the lane on a bicycle. Back on the round. Thomas Whitfield retired from the Down Special TPO in 1965. He had been on the route for 24 years. He had sorted the mail through the war years, through the post-war recovery, through the decade when personal letter volume in Britain was at its highest, and the pigeonholes filled fastest, and the sub-bags grew heaviest, and the overnight run carried more of what Britain had written that day than at any point in the system's long history. The Down Special ran for 39 more years after he retired. The last TPO ran on 9 January 2004. What the telephone gave the families along the route: the voice, the immediate answer, the second question, without waiting 2 weeks for the reply. What it did not ask them to do: keep what was said. The letters sorted on the Down Special through the years when Thomas Whitfield was at frame 4, the 2-page letters from Korea, the Forces mail from North Africa, the Christmas cards from Bradford to Glasgow, the everyday correspondence of a nation that had no faster way of reaching itself across distance. Those letters were kept. Some of them are in sideboards still, some are in shoeboxes under beds. The telephone, when it came, did not know to ask anyone to keep anything. It did not leave anything behind.